The security camera footage was crystal clear. Karen Morrison, the neighborhood's self-appointed queen, rifling through David Chen's mailbox like it was her personal treasure chest. But what she didn't know was that David had been watching her for weeks, documenting every theft, every violation of his privacy, and now, as she reached for the innocent-looking package he'd strategically placed, the one filled with the most putrid, horrifying stench known to mankind, David smiled from his window, because sometimes the sweetest revenge comes in the smallest, stinkiest packages. What happened next would turn their quiet suburban street into a battlefield, and transform a simple mail theft into something that would haunt Karen Morrison for the rest of her life. David Chen pressed his face against the cold glass of his living room window, his breath fogging the pain as he watched the familiar figure approach his mailbox. Again, Karen Morrison moved with the casual confidence of someone who believed the entire world belonged to her, her perfectly manicured nails glinting in the afternoon sun, as she reached into his mailbox without a shred of hesitation. "Are you kidding me?" David muttered, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. This was the fourth time this month, the fourth time he'd caught his neighbor, a woman who lived in a house 3 times the size of his modest 2-bedroom rental, stealing his mail like some common criminal. Karen's platinum blonde hair caught the light as she tilted her head, examining each piece of mail with the scrutiny of a jeweler appraising diamonds. She discarded his electric bill onto the ground with a dismissive flick of her wrist, kept what appeared to be a small package, and tossed his bank statement back into the box, but not before David saw her tear it open slightly at the corner. His phone buzzed against his palm. Another text from his landlord about the late rent notice that had supposedly been delivered but never made it to David's hands. The same rent notice that had probably ended up in Karen's perfectly organized home office, along with God knew what else she'd stolen over the past 6 months. "That's it," David whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with a determination that surprised even him. He'd tried being polite. He'd tried talking to her directly, only to be dismissed with a wave of her French-tipped nails and a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. He'd tried calling the postal service, but they'd told him to work it out with the neighbor or install a lock in mailbox, something his lease explicitly forbade. But David Chen hadn't survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and clawed his way through community college just to be bullied by some suburban princess who thought the world owed her everything. He grabbed his phone and opened the security app he'd installed last week. The tiny camera, no bigger than a button, sat perfectly concealed inside the decorative trim of his mailbox. He'd spent his last $40 on it, money he couldn't afford to lose, but it was about to pay the biggest dividend of his life. The footage was even better than he'd hoped, crystal clear, perfectly framed, showing Karen's face in vivid detail as she committed federal crime after federal crime. Her expression was almost serene, like she was picking flowers in her own garden rather than rifling through someone else's private correspondence. David's hands shook as he scrolled through weeks of recorded footage. There she was, day after day, treating his mailbox like her personal shopping center, taking packages, opening letters, discarding anything that didn't interest her onto his lawn like garbage. The scope of her theft was staggering, and suddenly, so many missing items made perfect sense. His veteran's disability check that had been lost in the mail for 3 weeks, the care package from his sister in California that never arrived, the job interview letter from the city that he'd only learned about when they called to ask why he'd missed the appointment. All of it, stolen by the woman who lived in the white colonial with the perfectly manicured lawn and the BMW parked in the circular driveway. A slow smile spread across David's face as an idea began to form. Not just any idea, perfect, beautiful, terrible idea that would give Karen Morrison exactly what she deserved. He'd learned a few things during his time in the military, including how to handle people who thought rules didn't apply to them. And he'd learned even more during his 2 years working at a chemical processing plant before he'd been laid off last month. Specifically, he'd learned about a particular compound that was completely legal to possess, completely harmless to humans, in small doses, but produced a smell so overwhelmingly putrid that it could clear a building in seconds. Thiostone, the chemistry textbooks called it the worst-smelling chemical known to man. David called it justice. His phone rang, interrupting his planning. The caller ID showed his sister's number. "Hey, Lynn," he answered, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. "David, did you get the package I sent last week? The one with Mom's recipe cards and the photo albums?" David's jaw clenched. "No, Lynn, it never showed up. That's weird. The tracking says it was delivered to your mailbox last Tuesday around noon." Last Tuesday. David quickly scrolled through his security footage. There, it was Karen Morrison, opening a package addressed to him, pulling out what looked like old photographs and recipe cards, examining them with interest before tucking the entire contents into her oversized purse. "I'll look into it," David said quietly. "Okay, but David, those recipe cards are irreplaceable. They're the only copies I have of Mom's handwriting. If they're lost, they're not lost," David said, his voice harder than he intended. "They're stolen, but don't worry, Lynn, I'm going to get them back." After he hung up, David sat in his small kitchen, staring at the security footage on his phone. Karen had stolen his mother's recipe cards, the last tangible connection he had to the woman who'd raised him after his father died, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, who'd never missed a single one of his high school football games despite being dead on her feet from exhaustion. The idea that had been forming crystallized into something cold and sharp and absolutely perfect. David spent the next hour researching. By the time the sun began to set, he had a complete plan. It would take 3 days to execute, but when it was finished, Karen Morrison would never steal another person's mail again. He started with a trip to the chemical supply company where he'd maintained contacts from his old job. Thiastone wasn't something you could buy at the local hardware store, but David knew people who could get it no questions asked, complete with proper safety equipment and detailed handling instructions. Next, he visited a packaging store in the next town over, paying cash for a small box, bubble wrap, and shipping materials. He addressed it to himself in his own handwriting, making sure to use the exact same pen and formatting style as the package his sister had sent. The final component was the most delicate, a small glass vial, specially designed to break when the package was opened with anything more than the gentlest touch. The kind of vial that would shatter instantly if someone tore into a package with the greedy enthusiasm that David had observed in Karen's thievery. On the 3rd day, David placed the package in his mailbox at exactly 11:47 a.m. According to his security footage, Karen typically arrived between noon and 12:30, depending on when her morning yoga class ended. He positioned himself at his living room window, phone ready to record, heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. At 12:23 p.m., Karen Morrison appeared. She moved with her usual confidence, her yoga outfit perfectly coordinated, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that probably cost more than David's monthly grocery budget. She approached his mailbox like she owned it, like the entire street existed for her convenience. David held his breath as Karen's fingers closed around the package. She examined the address, noting that it was intended for him, then smiled as she tucked it under her arm, along with 2 pieces of his regular mail. "Gotcha," David whispered. Karen turned toward her house, walking briskly across the street with her stolen prizes. David watched her disappear through her front door, then settled back to wait. He didn't have to wait long. Exactly 7 minutes later, a sound unlike anything David had ever heard erupted from the Morrison house. It wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite a roar, it was something primal and desperate and absolutely inhuman. Windows slammed open throughout the white colonial. Karen Morrison burst through her front door like the house was on fire, retching violently into her perfectly maintained rose bushes. But that wasn't the best part. The best part was what came next. Karen's husband Richard, stumbling out behind her, his face green with nausea. Then their teenage daughter Brittany, crying and gagging. Then their housekeeper, their dog. And finally, in a moment of perfect poetic justice, 3 police officers who had apparently been inside the house on an unrelated call. The entire Morrison family, plus half the neighborhood, stood in the street while the hazmat team that Richard had apparently called in a panic worked to ventilate their house. The smell was so potent that people were covering their faces from 2 blocks away. And through it all, Karen Morrison stood in her designer yoga outfit, covered in her own vomit, staring at David's house with an expression of pure, undiluted rage. She knew, somehow, she knew exactly who was responsible for turning her perfect life into a night. Part 2. The ESCAOND hazmat team finished their work at 6:47 p.m., but the Morrison house remained uninhabitable. David watched from his kitchen window as Karen paced back and forth on her front lawn, her cell phone pressed against her ear, her voice carrying across the street in sharp, angry bursts. "I don't care what it costs," she was saying to whoever had the misfortune of being on the other end of the call. "I want every hotel within 50 miles checked. Presidential suite, nothing less." Her husband Richard stood beside their BMW, looking like a man who'd just watched his entire world collapse. Their daughter Brittany sat on the curb, still dry heaving into a paper bag that one of the paramedics had given her. The family dog, a pristine white Pomeranian named Princess, whimpered pitifully from inside a pet carrier, apparently traumatized by whatever hell had been unleashed in their living room. Dave's phone buzzed. A text from his upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. "What happened over there? Smells like something died and came back to life just to die again." He was typing a response when he heard the sharp click of heels on pavement. Karen Morrison was crossing the street, moving toward his house with the purposeful stride of a woman who'd made a decision. Her yoga outfit was stained, her perfect hair disheveled, but her eyes burned with the kind of fury that could melt steel. David met her at his front door before she could knock. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice perfectly pleasant. Karen's face was a mask of barely controlled rage. "You think you're clever, don't you? I'm sorry. Don't." Her voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a scream. "Don't you dare pretend you don't know what you did." David tilted his head, the picture of confused innocence. "Mrs. Morrison, I have no idea what you're talking about. Is everything okay? I heard there was some kind of chemical accident at your house." "Chemical accident," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You sent me that package. You poisoned my home." Ma'am, I think you might be confused. I didn't send you anything. Why would I send you a package? For a moment, Karen's composure cracked entirely. Her hands shook as she pointed a manicured finger at his chest. Because you actually think that you can mess with me, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. Again, I really don't know what my husband is. Richard Morrison. Morrison Development Group. We own half the commercial real estate in this county. Her voice was rising now, drawing attention from the neighbors who had gathered to gawk at the ongoing disaster. I have lawyers who eat people like you for breakfast. I have connections that go all the way to the mayor's office, and when I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never been born. David felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Mrs. Morrison, I think you should probably go deal with your family. They look like they need you. She leaned closer, her voice dropping, back to that terrifying whisper. This isn't over. Not even close. As she walked away, David noticed something that made his blood run cold. Karen wasn't walking back toward her family. She was walking toward the black sedan that had just pulled up across the street, a sedan with government plates and two men in cheap suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a federal law enforcement training manual. David's military training kicked in. He stepped back inside his house, locked the door, and immediately went to his laptop. If Karen had connections that reached federal agencies, if she could somehow spin this into something bigger than a petty neighborhood dispute, he needed to be prepared. He spent the next hour uploading every piece of security footage to 3 different cloud storage accounts. The evidence of Karen's mail theft, documented over weeks, stored safely beyond the reach of anyone who might want to make it disappear. Then, he encrypted the files and sent copies to his sister with instructions to contact a specific veterans' rights attorney if anything happened to him. By the time he finished, the government sedan was gone, but a new vehicle had taken its place, a white van with Morrison Development painted on the side. 2 men were unloading equipment that looked suspiciously like surveillance gear. David's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Hello, Mr. Chen. The voice was professional, clipped. This is Agent Sarah Rodriguez with the Postal Inspection Service. I understand there's been an incident involving mail tampering in your neighborhood. David's heart hammered against his ribs. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. We take mail theft very seriously. Federal crime, carries up to 5 years in prison. Now, I'm going to ask you directly. Have you been interfering with mail delivery in your area? Agent Rodriguez, I haven't interfered with anything, but I have been the victim of mail theft for months. I have extensive documentation if you'd like to see it. There was a pause. Documentation. Security camera footage. Weeks of it. Showing my neighbor stealing my mail on a daily basis. I'd be happy to provide everything to your office. Another pause. Longer this time. Mr. Chen, I'm going to need you to come down to our field office tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have. After he hung up, David realized he was sweating. Karen Morrison wasn't just rich and connected, she was smart. She'd somehow managed to turn his act of justified revenge into a federal investigation with him as the primary suspect. But David had spent years dealing with people who underestimated him, who thought that because he was quiet and kept to himself, he was weak. Karen Morrison was about to learn the same lesson that a Taliban commander had learned in Kandahar. David Chen didn't start fights, but he sure as hell finished them. He spent that night preparing for war. The next morning, David arrived at the Postal Inspection Service field office with a briefcase full of evidence, and a veterans' rights attorney named Marcus Weberman, who specialized in cases where former military personnel were being railroaded by wealthy civilians with political connections. Agent Rodriguez was younger than she'd sounded on the phone, with sharp eyes and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that David recognized from his own military service. She led them into a small interview room, and got straight to the point. Mr. Chen, we received a complaint yesterday evening alleging that you've been stealing mail from your neighbors and using some kind of chemical weapon to terrorize the Morrison family. Webb leaned forward. Agent Rodriguez, before my client responds to any allegations, we'd like to present evidence that Mrs. Morrison has been systematically stealing Mr. Chen's mail for months. David opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet loaded with security footage. This goes back 6 weeks, he said. Every single day, Mrs. Morrison removes mail from my mailbox. Letters, packages, official documents. She opens some of it, keeps what interests her, and discards the rest. Agent Rodriguez watched the footage in silence, her expression growing darker with each clip. After 20 minutes, she sat back in her chair and rubbed her temples. Jesus Christ, she muttered. How much mail are we talking about? Conservatively, 40 to 50 pieces, including government correspondence, financial documents, and personal packages. David pulled out a printed list. I've documented everything. I remember receiving versus what actually made it to my hands. The discrepancy is significant, and Mrs. Morrison claims you sent her some kind of chemical weapon. Webb smiled grimly. Agent Rodriguez, my client is a veteran with training in chemical handling. If he wanted to hurt someone, he certainly wouldn't need to resort to mail fraud to do it. What he sent, David said carefully, was a perfectly legal substance designed to deter theft, like a dye pack in a bank robbery. but with smell instead of color. Mrs. Morrison was only exposed because she opened mail that wasn't addressed to her agent. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. Then she closed the file in front of her and looked directly at David. Mr. Chen, I'm going to be straight with you. The Morrison family has connections. Important connections. But what I just watched is a clear pattern of federal mail theft, and I don't give a damn who her husband knows. She stood up. I'm going to recommend that we pursue charges against Mrs. Morrison, multiple counts of mail theft, possibly identity fraud, depending on what she did with your information. But I need you to understand something. This is going to get ugly. These people have money and lawyers, and they're going to fight back hard. David met her gaze steadily. Agent Rodriguez, I've been fighting my entire adult life. Mrs. Morrison picked the wrong person to mess with. 2 hours later, David was back home when he heard the commotion outside. Through his window, he watched as 2 federal agents knocked on Karen Morrison's door. The family had apparently been staying at a hotel, but they'd come back to collect belongings and deal with the contractors who were still trying to decontaminate their house. Karen answered the door in a designer tracksuit, her face carefully composed until she saw the badges. Then her expression crumbled into something desperate and ugly. There must be some mistake, she was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the street. I would never. This is harassment. My husband will hear about this. But the agents weren't listening to her protests. They were reading her rights, and David could see the exact moment when Karen Morrison realized that her money and connections weren't going to save her from the consequences of her actions as they led her toward their unmarked car. Karen looked directly at David's house. Even from a distance, his military training kicked in before his conscious mind fully processed what was happening. He rolled out of bed, staying low, and crawled to the window. The streetlight illuminated his front yard, clearly enough to see the damage. Every window on the ground floor of his house had been shattered, and his car, his 15-year-old Honda that he'd been nursing along for the past 3 years, sat on 4 flat tires with terrace spray painted across the windshield in dripping red letters. But the vandalism wasn't what made David's blood run cold. It was the figure standing under the streetlight across the street, making no attempt to hide. Richard Morrison stood with his arms crossed, wearing a dark suit despite the hour, watching David's house with the patient satisfaction of a man who'd just delivered the opening move in a chess game. David's phone buzzed. A text from the same unknown number as before. Did you really think the federal government would protect you? Check your credit report, check your employment history, check your veterans benefits. Then we'll talk. With shaking hands, David opened his laptop and logged into his credit monitoring account. What he saw there made his stomach drop through the floor. 3 new credit cards had been opened in his name in the past 6 hours. A mortgage application had been submitted and rejected, tanking his credit score. Dozens of accounts showed suspicious activity, and his Identity Theft Protection Service had sent 17 emergency alerts that had somehow gone straight to his spam folder. But that was just the beginning. When he checked his veteran's disability claim status, he found that a complaint had been filed alleging he'd misrepresented his service record. His disability payments, the only reliable income he had, were now under review, pending a thorough investigation. The investigation could take months, and in the meantime, his benefits were suspended. The final blow came when he checked his email. A message from the temp agency he'd been working with. Due to concerning information that has come to our attention regarding your background and character, we can no longer provide placement services. Please do not contact our office. Again, David sank into his kitchen chair, staring at the screen in disbelief. In less than 12 hours, Richard Morrison had somehow managed to destroy his credit, eliminate his income, and systematically dismantled the life David had spent years rebuilding after his discharge from the military. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus Webb, his attorney. David, I'm sorry to call so early, but we have a problem. A big one. How big? The Postal Service investigation has been transferred to a different agent, someone with ties to the Morrison family, and there are rumors that the U.S. Attorney's Office is considering federal charges against you for domestic terrorism. David's vision went gray around the edges. Domestic terrorism, chemical weapons in the mail system, they're calling it an attack on federal infrastructure. David, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not talk to anyone without me present. Do not go anywhere alone, and start thinking about where you can stay that isn't your current address. After Webb hung up, David sat in his destroyed living room and tried to process what was happening. 6 months ago, he'd been a quiet veteran trying to rebuild his life after military service. Now he was apparently a domestic terrorist being hunted by the federal government at the behest of a woman, whose only crime he'd exposed was stealing mail. But David Chen hadn't survived 3 combat tours by giving up when the odds turned against him, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let Richard Morrison destroy him without a fight. He spent the next hour uploading every document he could find to encrypted cloud storage, his military service records, medical files, financial statements, and most importantly, every piece of communication he'd ever received from any government agency. If Morrison wanted to play dirty, David would make sure there was a paper trail that led directly back to him. Then he made a phone call. Lynn, it's David. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it right now. His sister's voice was thick with sleep. David, it's 4 in the morning. What's wrong? Everything. The people I told you about, the ones who were stealing my mail, they're fighting back. They're trying to destroy my life, and they might succeed. I need you to contact every journalist you know, every veteran advocacy group, every civil rights organization. I'm going to send you a data package, and if something happens to me, I need you to make sure it gets out. David, you're scaring me? Good. You should be scared. These people have connections. I can't fight through normal channels, but they made one mistake. They went after a veteran, and they did it in a way that's going to look really bad in the press. By sunrise, David had sent his sister enough documentation to sink a battleship, service records proving his decorated military career, medical files showing his legitimate disability rating, financial records proving he'd never been anything but honest in his dealings with the government, and most damning of all, a detailed timeline showing how Richard Morrison had managed to weaponize multiple federal agencies against a disabled veteran in less than 12 hours. David was brewing coffee when he heard vehicles pulling up outside. Through his broken window, he watched 3 black SUVs surround his house. Federal agents emerged, wearing tactical gear and carrying the kind of hardware that meant they weren't expecting a peaceful conversation. But David had been expecting. He opened his front door before they could knock, his hands visible and empty, his military bearing evident in every line of his posture. Gentlemen, he said calmly, I assume you're here about the domestic terrorism allegations. The lead agent, a tall man with graying temples, looked surprised by David's composure. Mr. Chen, I'm Agent Harrison with the FBI. We have a warrant to search these premises. Of course you do. David stepped aside. You'll find everything exactly where it should be. But before you start, I think you should know that every major news outlet in the country is going to be very interested in this story. Agent Harrison paused. What story? The story about how a disabled veteran exposed his neighbor's mail theft and suddenly found himself being investigated for domestic terrorism by agents with connections to the thief's family? David's voice was steady, but his eyes were hard. The story about how federal agencies can be weaponized against private citizens by people with enough money and influence. Mr. Chen, I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything. Agent Harrison, I'm stating facts. And in about 6 hours, those facts are going to be front-page news unless this investigation disappears as quickly as it appeared. For the first time, Agent Harrison looked uncertain. He glanced back at his team, then at David. Mr. Chen, are you threatening federal agents? I'm informing federal agents that they're being used as pawns in a rich family's personal vendetta? The question is, do you want to be part of that story, or do you want to be the agents who exposed it? David pulled out his phone and showed Harrison a news alert. Veteran faces. Federal investigation after exposing neighbor's mail theft had just gone live on 3 major news websites simultaneously. Harrison's face went pale. How did Agent Harrison? I spent 3 tours fighting people who thought they could intimidate me with superior firepower. Richard Morrison is about to learn what those people learned. I don't intimidate easily, and I don't fight fair. The search took 4 hours, but David could tell the agents' hearts weren't in it. They went through the motions, but the lead agent kept checking his phone, and David could see the exact moment when Harrison realized that this investigation was going to destroy careers, starting with his own. When they finished, Harrison approached David with an expression that was equal parts respect and concern. Mr. Chen, off the record, you need to be very careful. The Morrison family doesn't just have money, they have the kind of connections that can make people disappear from the system entirely. Agent Harrison, the Morrison family just made their biggest mistake. They turned a private dispute into a federal case, and they did it against someone who has nothing left to lose. David met the agent's eyes steadily. I'm not the victim here. Anymore, I'm the weapon. As the FBI vehicles pulled away, David's phone rang. The caller ID showed Richard Morrison's number. Mr. Chen. Morrison's voice was calm, but David could hear the strain underneath. I think it's time we had a conversation. I think you're right. There's a coffee shop on 5th Street, neutral ground, 1 hour. David looked across the street at the Morrison house where contractors were still working to remove the lingering effects of his stink bomb. Karen was visible through an upstairs window, pacing back and forth while talking animatedly on her phone. 1 hour, David agreed. Come alone. Because if Richard Morrison wanted to negotiate, it meant David's counterattack was working. And if Morrison thought he could intimidate a combat veteran into backing down, he was about to discover just how wrong he could be. The war for David's life was entering a new phase. And for the first time since this began, David felt like he might actually win. But as he watched Karen Morrison gesturing frantically from her window, he had the unsettling feeling that the real battle was still ahead of him.